Strahd von Zarovich. Strahd von Zarovich, a vampire and wizard, has the statistics presented in Appendix D. Although he can be encountered almost anywhere in his domain, the vampire is always encountered in the place indicated by the card reading later in this chapter, unless he has been forced into his tomb in the catacombs of Castle Ravenloft. The vampire's history. In life, Strahd von Zarovich was a count, a prince, a soldier, and a conqueror. After the death of his father, King Barov, Strahd waged long, bloody wars against his family's enemies. He and his army cornered the last of these enemies in a remote mountain valley before slaying them all. And that massacre, it begins the history of Count Strahd von Zarovich, who is, of course, the antagonist in Curse of Strahd, to my knowledge, the best-selling 5th edition product outside of the big 3 books. And with us to discuss it today are Dr. Scott Bruner and Dr. Joseph P. Laycock, who Scott and I are both incredibly enthusiastic to have on. He is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Texas State University, and he writes on a variety of topics related to American religious history, including American Catholicism, moral panics, and new religious movements. I have a number of your books, but I'll casually throw out your Penguin Book of Exorcism. The ending is so terrifying, it kept me up at night, your last account of an exorcism from that book. But we are here mostly because you wrote a book called Dangerous Games. Would you like to give the capsule pitch of what Dangerous Games is, Joe?
Sure. I was a gamer, from an early age, and I had a sense that I had something important to say about Dungeons and Dragons, but I wasn't quite sure what it was until I got a PhD in the sociology of religion. So it's a book about the moral panic over Dungeons and Dragons. I grew up in Texas in the 80s, and I heard all the time that, this game caused suicide and Satan worship. And so I partly just wanted to kind of tell that story because I think a lot of people didn't even know that that happened until, the new season of Stranger Things. They didn't realize that was a thing, or they didn't realize quite how out of control it was. You had people running for state offices, and their whole campaign was, "I'm going to ban this game. I'm going to protect you from this game." So that's one half of the book, but the other half is kind of really getting into what is so special about fantasy role-playing games that out of
Yeah.
all the things that these moral entrepreneurs could have been crusading against, they picked this. And what I conclude is they were not entirely wrong. They said Dungeons and Dragons is a religion, and by that I don't mean it's a religion in the way that Christianity or Buddhism or Islam are religions, but it is potentially doing religious work. And I think for some of these fundamentalists, they began to worry, gosh, if you can just make up a pantheon of gods and a group of people can make that seem real, have I dedicated my life to something that was also just made up by people? Right. And so I think for some of them at least, it was a kind of cognitive dissonance. And the move was, no, 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 no. My religion isn't a game. Your game is a religion. And that kind of makes them feel better. The other thing I think was going on was that games of imagination like Dungeons and Dragons bring with them this very kind of radical autonomy. And so I think for some people, they understood the imagination is the enemy. Right. If we were trying to have maximum control over society, a game where people are encouraged to imagine the world being a different way from the way it is something that we have to eliminate. So I come off eventually saying that the evangelicals are not entirely wrong. They detected something special going on with this game, but the only way that they could express it was it's demonic and it's evil.
Yeah, there's so much I've been.
Go, Scott, go.
Yeah, I want to stop myself because I really want to know why you wanted to talk about Strahd, especially in relationship to your book. But one of the things that I find really interesting, and again, it's going to be hard for me to stay away from kind of my own work, but one of the the theorists that the main theorist that got in my work is somebody that comes out of UC Santa Cruz by the name of Karen Barad, who talks about something called agential realism. And one of the things I was struck by, because it's something, a passage that I just read in your book, was this concept of what you're talking about, which is that people were so afraid of Dungeons and Dragons. And by the way, I've never heard the term moral entrepreneurs to your book, and now I can't stop using it. But I keep like talking to people like, don't be a moral entrepreneur.
I'm sorry, Joe, could you tell my audience what a moral entrepreneur is, please?
Yeah, I mean the other word that gets used is claims makers.
Yeah.
But this term I think comes from Stanley Cohen's book Folk Devils and Moral Panics, where he was sort of one of the first sociologists to talk about the phenomenon of moral panics. But these are people who are kind of saying, things like, "Won't someone please think of the children?"
Yeah.
And these could be religious people, they could be pastors, they could be politicians, they could be YouTubers, or even someone in your school board or something like this. But they are all in the business of selling you that there is some kind of moral threat that people need to organize and rally against. So the term moral entrepreneurs is just a good kind of blanket term to describe people making those kinds of calls to action, whatever field they happen to be in.
Yeah, it may simply be because of the context that I was reading it in your book, but I don't think I've ever had a phrase where I instantly kind of knew what it meant. Like what as soon as you say moral entrepreneur, I think I think in terms of like the concept of commercialism, capitalism. When I hear the term, it's like people that are literally in the trade of telling you what you should believe, think, and feel, or what value system you should get. But the comment I wanted to make, and actually I want to throw it as a question, is the thing that strikes me is one of the things that I do think, and I'm a big fan of not saying I don't like the concept. Like we talk so much about tabletop role playing games being this new innovative, completely revelatory new medium. And despite the fact that I love them, I don't like that kind of hyperbole. But one thing that I do think is true is it really does give people this kind of strange agency to make their own worlds and their own values. And I feel like the agency of one of the things you mentioned in your book is this concept that it allows people to imagine alternative realities, play with them, imagine themselves in an, and then that allows them in, and I hate the term, the real world, or at least in the, as you put it, in the profane world, to kind of play with their own identities in that world. And so I guess the question that I'm going to throw back to you is the thing that's so revelatory or so new about tabletop role playing games, is it that agency that it allows people to have the permission to practice? Is that what's really, really important about tabletop role playing games?
To practice what, Scott, if I may ask?
To practice this concept that you can build your own new realities, dwell within them, and simply imagine realities that are just as important as the ones that you have to pay taxes and rent in.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm drawing on a number of kind of theorists of religion here, but I think that human beings are sort of inherently invested in having alternative realities. I think that humans in some way need that to be healthy. And they were doing that obviously long before Dungeons and Dragons, but they were doing it through fictional media of all kinds, movies, through religious rites, through play, right? And one of the theorists that I draw in the book is Robert Bella, and he theorizes, drawing on Johann Huizinga, that religion and indeed all human culture emerges out of play, right? Out of the play world, right? And so if you put kids in the backyard and they're bored, within about 10 minutes they'll have invented a game, and within about 15 minutes they'll have rules for the game and they'll be angry, right, if their playmate breaks the rules. And Huizinga said, I think that's the origin of all human culture, right? We have these rules, they're very serious, but they could be a different way. It's kind of arbitrary that they are the way they are, and it comes about through play and through ritual. And so we are in kind of like a fixed a world that we kind of think of as being the real world or being society or something like that. And then we also need some kind of escape from that. So Victor Turner is another theorist that I use, and he said he wrote a lot about liminality. So he said, when you go on a religious pilgrimage, you get a chance to kind of reinvent yourself. And then when you come back from the pilgrimage, you're a different person, right? You can actually have a new title and things like that because you've completed the pilgrimage. And then later he said, I think that people go to dive bars kind of for the same reason that they go on pilgrimage.
Sure.
Right? It's that you can't, like, I can't just be the college professor all day long, all week. At some point I have to go to a dive bar, and then
Yeah.
I can act differently and I can curse finally, right? And that's kind of necessary. Sigmund Freud talked about this too, that sort of you didn't ask for your life, and you can only bear your life without interruption for so long. Right? Or you'll sort of go insane. So I think that's he's also talking about a similar sort of thing. And then the theorist that's kind of the most controversial that I use is Mircea Eliade,
Yes. Yes.
who was very, very popular in the 60s and 70s, is not popular now, and that's partly because of his connections to fascism back in his day, but also because he kind of assumed that all religious people are sort of encountering this one great essence that's kind of known by many names, and he didn't really have any evidence for that. He just sort of assumed it. But I do think that Eliade thought humans are driven by ontological thirst, is what he called it, a sort of need to connect with some kind of alternate reality. And they've traditionally gotten this through sitting around the campfire and telling sacred stories and reenacting those stories through religious rituals. And I don't think he was all wrong about that. And I think there is something very unique to role playing where you are sort of collectively conjuring up this other world that you're all going to inhabit. And it's very similar to Eliade's theories. And I would actually say that, like, a group of Catholics on Holy Week sort of acting out the story of the Passion, and kind of experiencing it in this sort of special way together is not so different from a gaming group
Yes.
kind of bringing this imaginary story and making it seem uniquely real for the duration of the game.
Yeah. The question I went through is, I absolutely agree on all those things. What do you think in that? And I always want to steer people to the book because I think you probably answer this question, but I've got you now, so I'm going to buttonhole you and ask you, why was that so terrifying to the moral entrepreneurs in the 1980s?
Yeah. Well, I think that, there's a couple reasons to this. I think that their version of Christianity had become very fragile in a way that Christianity has historically not been. Because if you read early modern Christians, they'll often say things like, well, the imagination is a gift from God, right? And in
Right.
fact, the imagination is a way that we can know God because we can't perceive God through our senses. And at some point, that had flipped to the imagination is essentially demonic, right?
Right.
And
Right.
if you are imagining a demon, that's not your imagination. There's really a demon there. Or one person even said, reality is the way it is because that's God's will. And so if you
Yeah.
imagine something other than reality, you are, in a sense, defying God. So fire engines are red because God wants fire engines to be red. And if you imagine a blue fire engine, that is literally a satanic activity, right?
Yeah.
That is denying God's attempt to impose his will on the cosmos. And so I think there's a number of culprits to this, but I think one was this move towards, biblical literalism, which has not historically been part of Christianity, which begins really in the 1920s when these pamphlets called the Fundamentals were written, and a real fear that this kind of a form of intense sort of literalist fundamentalist Christianity would not be passed on to the next generation, and that anything that's sort of a threat to that, be it rock music or now they might say cultural Marxism or whatever, that it has to be stamped out. And I'm using kind of the hermeneutics of suspicion to this. It was rare that they would actually come out and say these things, but there were a few clues, and one of them was Patricia Pulling, who founded
Yeah.
Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And she said, don't you know they have books with gods in them? And somebody said, but don't you think the children can understand that these are just imaginary gods from a storybook? And she said, well, they believe in God and they only know about God from reading it in the Bible. Right? And what seemed to be at stake with that comment is, if I think about this for too long, I'm going to realize that my religion was just made up, by a bunch of people. My religion is imaginary too. And so some of this at least seems to be an attempt to kind of stamp that down.
Yeah.
by kind of denying that the imagination even exists. There's just demons,
So
right?
I was gonna try and pivot to Barovia, but then you brought up Patricia Pulling, and now I can't help but ask a few things because one of the truly dazzling aspects of Dangerous Games was the amount of research that you put into this.
Yes. Yeah.
Like again, you uh, it arrived and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to know almost everything in this book already. And then I start reading it and I'm like, I was wrong.
Yep.
Laycock has shown me things that I did not know were there.
Some
And
of the Dragon magazine articles and some of the snippets he brought out of like classic Dragon magazine articles, especially some of the letters, the letters that people were writing were just so compelling.
but if you would be kind, assuming that this is in your memory banks, could you give a brief version of Patricia Pulling, Bink Pulling, and then tell us about finding Bink's dungeon master?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I have a lot of the sources that I found were from the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games. So those were people who really did this hard work in the '80s to collect all of this because they were literally trying to combat bad. They were trying to combat bothered about Dungeons and Dragons by sort of going on the counteroffensive. So they had collected all of this data. But anyways, the sort of beginning of the moral panic starts with Dallas Egbert, who sort of disappears and tragically eventually commits suicide. And his parents hired this totally wackadoo private investigator named William Deere, who said, this boy is basically had a psychotic break and thinks he's a medieval warrior and is wandering around in steam tunnel thinking he's in a dungeon. None of this was remotely true, but it became the basis of a really regrettable Tom Hanks movie, as you
Oh,
describe in your book. And so Patricia Pulling was kind of part two of that. So her son Irving, who went by Bink, committed suicide. And the narrative that she formed around this was basically that his suicide was a result of playing Dungeons and Dragons as part of his honors English class in public school, and that the game had basically programmed him, like the movie The Manchurian Candidate, to come home and kill his entire family. And so the only way that he could override this basically hypnotic programming from playing Dungeons and Dragons was to kill himself. So in the story that she eventually spun, her son hadn't committed suicide at all. Her son had basically martyred himself to save his family from being physically murdered by Dungeons and Dragons. I can understand why someone would prefer to believe that that's what happened. I can't quite understand being able to convince yourself that that's what happened. But I did get in touch with Bank's Dungeon Master, who said basically that Bank probably only ever played Dungeons and Dragons for about 5 hours in his entire life. Apparently, part of the campaign they were doing did involve Bank's character becoming a werewolf and being cursed with lycanthropy. And so there was this sort of poem written on a note, because it is an English class after all, describing this curse about, you will become a beast in the land, a killer of man, or something like that. So I think
Nice
that
rhyme.
became kind of the basis of this Manchurian Candidate that her son had become a brainwashed assassin. But apparently, Bink had been having a lot of emotional problems in school. He had written "Life is a Joke" on this blackboard. Corey Dungeon Master, both of his parents were having affairs with other people. His mother was Jewish, and the really old school second edition character sheets have a little box to draw a symbol for your character, right? Some of your listeners probably remember that. Well, the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games had Bink's old character sheet. They sent me a photocopy of it, and there was a swastika in the little sort of character symbol. And it wasn't just a swastika, there was like a sword or something like that too. But this is obviously, it would be troubling from anybody, but it especially be troubling from someone with a Jewish mother. So there was a lot going on there. So I think there would have been probably a lot of guilt, even more so than you'd normally have when a child commits suicide. And so that seems to have set Patricia Pulling kind of on her path, and then her authority as a moral entrepreneur did not come from her education or anything like that. It just came from her story. The story of this sort of bereaved mother who had lost everything because of this game was so compelling that it was like catnip for 2020 and other kinds of shows that wanted to host her, even though the things she was saying often didn't really make any sense if you actually stopped to think about them.
And for listeners who may be unaware, finding that dungeon master is a stunning act of I'm sure diligence and research, or maybe luck. For all I know, he emailed you one day. That kind of stuff happens too. But uh, that just stands out in my mind as a acme of excellence from your work. So, Scott, do you want to say anything about this, or can we actually talk about Barovia and Strahd for a minute?
I mean, there's so much to say, and as you know, I always have so many things to say. But I do want to, before we go back to Barovia, I think I don't know. It's so interesting. The thing that I'm really stuck on is how there were so many different like the emergence of Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games in the 1970s and 1980s, all these like kind of different moving parts. It always reads a little bit like a soap opera in some ways. Like it's interesting to me that all these personalities and the human subjectivities at play and how like there was part of me thinking about this, and I know that Stranger Things in many ways taps into the kind of the nostalgia of people for that time, but there was something especially about the early emergence of tabletop role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons that is such a power and such a weird, and this is of course very much a lot of the basis of your book, but this concept of like forbidden tomes, and Ben, you and I have talked many times on the fact like when we open up the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book, how it felt like because of the way that it was being contextualized in society is like almost an Necronomicon that you would open it, and the I guess the only comment I want to make before we go to Ravenloft, and I think that we should, is how in the early stage is how real this satanic panic was. And I know that I imagine a lot of our listeners are probably in a little bit of our age group and they probably remember this thing. But for those that don't, it is really strange how modern tabletop role-playing game is viewed as, it's like it's taught in schools now. We think about it as something that's like we think about its pedagogical capacities. But in the 1979s and 1980s, it was more like heavy metal music, right? It belonged to the same social context as like Iron Maiden albums, or even more appropriately like a Black Sabbath album. It was forbidden and it was strange and it was dangerous, and that's been lost. And I think like before we move on, how can we talk for just a second around how scary it felt in some ways, both like that it was both the attraction for players, but also like that was part of the attraction, that it was very real, that this felt like a forbidden practice that people were delving into.
Yeah, and there were sort of weird, elements of the occult kind of in the game. So I remember being in the fourth grade and looking at, these illustrations of pentagrams and magic circles and things like this. And on the one hand, I was smart enough to understand this is just like a cool thing you could put in your dungeon, and they'd be like, uh-oh, there's like an evil wizard in here, right? But on the other hand, being like, I wonder where they found it. I wonder what would happen if I drew this on the floor, right?
Right.
What would this do? So in some ways, it was introducing people to these ideas of the occult, and I think most players thought this is sort of, it's just pretend, it doesn't matter. And maybe a few of them grew up to become a Wiccan or something like that, right? Because they played Dungeons and Dragons. But there was this sense that this was something very dangerous. This was my first inkling as a child that adults don't actually know anything,
Yeah.
right? Because they were so certain this was this evil game, and I'm like, no, we're just a bunch of dumb kids, eating Doritos or something, right? How could you possibly think that? I think the scariest part, and I think Stranger Things kind of portrayed this, was, traditionally in the 80s and 90s, D&D players were kind of the bottom of the food chain of the high school, right? They were not athletes. They were not popular. They were prone to being bullied. And this was back before, we had anti-bullying campaigns or anything like that, right? And there was this weird kind of alliance between the bullies and the moral authorities, where the bullies felt like they had some
Yeah.
kind of, moral license, right?
Yep.
So, if I were going to go shove a kid's head in the toilet because they've got glasses, well, then I'd be being a bully. But if I'm doing it because they play Dungeons and Dragons, then I'm doing this for God,
Yeah.
right? I'm
Yeah.
doing this to
Yeah.
protect my whole community from Satan. And so I did get a little bit of that growing up in Texas. And to me, I think that was kind of the most disturbing part of the whole thing.
Ben, did you ever have players that weren't allowed to play D&D in your groups when you were younger? I mean, it's funny because I think of my next door neighbor was never allowed, who's one of my good friends, who was never allowed to play D&D with me. Somebody I run a long running first edition group, and one of those players never was allowed to play D&D until he was like 30 years old because he grew up in a fundamentalist. Ben, did you have anybody like that was not allowed to play D&D
No,
as a kid?
but I assume you both have heard the story of Monty Cook and Bruce Cordell.
Please tell it.
So, Monty Cook, third edition designer, one of the main third edition designers, he grew up in North Dakota, and his best friend was Bruce Cordell, who is also a D&D designer, novelist, and Man About Seattle now. And Monty Cook's parents, or at least one of his parents, was hugely anti D&D, and was seduced by the moral panickers at the time. So his parents made him get rid of all of his stuff, and he just took it over and gave it to Bruce Cordell, and would go over to Bruce Cordell's house and play there and make characters there and all that. And my understanding is that Monty Cook has somehow made peace with his parents. I have not gotten the full story on that yet. Maybe I will one day. Maybe Monty won't tell me. I don't know. But later on, Monty was working at TSR and got Bruce Cordell a job at TSR. So it's one of those funny things where, again, they met when they were like 12, 13 years old, and they're still working together. And I assume they're both in their 60s. So that's a remarkable life of creativity together. But no, I didn't have anyone to play D&D with. And then when I did have people to play with, we started playing Rifts.
I vividly remember that it was always weird when D&D was coming out, especially that like the regular friend group that we had when we played D&D, 2 or 3 had to leave.
Wait, when you were playing what?
D&D.
First edition?
Yes.
Okay.
We were usually playing the Moldvay Basic.
Okay. I have an inflammatory question that I've written down, and I'm going to ask it. So, D&D is a practice that is kind of ministered to by corporations of one size or another at this point. Do you think it would be useful or wise to organize tabletop role-playing games in some way along religious lines? Call it a church of tabletop role. If there can be an atheistic church of Satan, why not a agnostic church of tabletop role-playing games? Do you think that would be useful or wise for people who played role-playing games to do?
I mean, they're going to do it anyway. In my book, we talk about Dragon Raid, which I actually have a copy of, which is still in the shrink wrap. I haven't opened it, but Dragon Raid was an evangelical answer to Dungeons and Dragons, and there were rune words, so you had to literally memorize Bible verses, and then you would win or not depending on if you could successfully repeat, verses from the King James Bible, which I thought was hilarious because that's what they were accusing D&D players of doing, right? Of sort of, well, when they cast spells, they have to learn these occult rituals, right? Actually, you're the ones who are making people perform religious rituals as part of this. Dragon Raid, though, was an utter failure. My friend bought me a copy of it because I think there was just a warehouse of this stuff left over from the 80s. And the reason it failed is that the evangelicals said this is an even sneakier way to damn our children. Right. First, they disguise it as a game, and then they disguise it as a Christian game. And they were able to home in on things like, well, how come you can have an animal companion in this game? That seems pretty satanic to me. I did see a pitch more recently for a Bible-themed role-playing game that actually seemed kind of interesting because it was trying to take the Gospels and present them as a fantasy story, right? So in religious studies, we talk about making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And it was trying to say, well, you think this story of Jesus, but actually you don't. And there's this sort of great evil coming for people, but there's whispers of a savior right? And then with the classes and races, so you could be like a magi, right? You could be like a Nephilim, right? You could have like some giant heritage or something like that. So they were really digging deep into kind of the more fantastical elements of the Bible, and I actually thought it looked kind of cool. I don't think I want to do a whole campaign of it, but it actually looked pretty fun, or really a fun thing to include in like a New Testament class at a college or something like that to finish off the semester. So yeah, I think these things could be done well. And the last thing I'll say is I've met pastors who've said, I run a D&D game with my parishioners, and some of them have even said, it's this doesn't open you up to the demonic. It's actually the opposite. It's a kind of a form of apologetics, that sort of there is more to the universe than just our paychecks and our internet and so forth. And this is actually kind of spiritually healthy to play games of imagination like this. So yeah, I think they could totally be compatible. In fact, it was probably a kind of missed opportunity in the 80s. If those Christians had not been so afraid of the imagination, they could have done this much differently.
One of the things I think is fascinating that I was thinking about when reading your book is it's always interesting to think about, as the more entrepreneurs are really striking back against Dungeons and Dragons as being this kind of satanic influence, when you think that the two original co-creators of Dungeons and Dragons were both rather committed committed Christians, right? And one of the things I thought was really interesting that I didn't know about from your book was that some of the spells for the clerics are literally based on passages from you just mentioned. You got my brain going because you'd mentioned the summon animals, which, if I'm not mistaken, comes from a prophet being able to summon
the
animals.
bears summoning two bears.
The she bears, right? I thought that was fascinating that these spells are literally based on biblical tales.
Not only that, but that story in Second Kings sounds like something that would happen in a D&D game, right? Oh, you're going to call me bald? I'm going to use a 6th level spell to kill all the children.
Right.
Could you explain to our listeners who are not so familiar with Second Kings? It was Elisha or Elisha, I think.
It's Elisha,
the prophet Elisha.
Elisha.
The protege of Elijah. But yeah, he is mocked for being a bald-headed prophet, and he curses a group of, I think it's 42 children. It's not a couple children, and God sends these 2 she bears that come and maul them all. And of course, in the logic of the Bible, they deserve this, or God wouldn't have helped, right?
Yeah.
But if I were to give people a quiz of did this happen in a D&D game or the Bible, right? I think people would get it wrong.
God. When you talk about people worrying, hey, maybe my stuff is all just made up from a book, that story and that reframing of context really is persuasive and perhaps would cause some existential distress if I was unprepared for it.
I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, but they think the sources for First and Second Kings were sort of actual chronicles of the monarchy of Israel and Judah, and then folk tales, right? So you can kind of imagine someone saying, what happened to the last little boy who made fun of a prophet? Don't you know? And then the story kind of finds its way into the Bible.
That's like the first TPK, right? From the she-bears.
God. All right, so let me ask you this: Are you playing any tabletop role-playing games right now?
Yes, we have a faculty game at Texas State that's been going for some time. There is a history professor who is usually our DM, and he is running Drakkenheim.
Ooh.
So we have been playing Drakkenheim and slowly mutating for several months now. Yeah.
Joe,
go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Ben. But Joe, are you the DM or are you a player?
I am a player.
What do you play?
Well, this is the second campaign that we've done. So in the first campaign, nobody had ever really played before, and we weren't sure it was going to be a whole campaign, and we're all first level, and everybody picked these really squishy characters. So I said, I am going to be the toughest character I can think of to keep you all alive. So I made a mountain dwarf fighter, and I took the bodyguard ability so I could intercept attacks on all the squishy first level players. And then that campaign ended up going for 2 years. So eventually my dwarf bodyguard became, 10th level, and My wife also plays in this campaign. The DM kind of shipped us. She was a dwarf cleric, and we ended up having a daughter, and there was kind of a whole kind of a sequence of events. And so this campaign, the circumstances were different. So I'm playing a human wizard. I modeled my wizard on this Tibetan epic called Milarepa, and
Sure. Yeah.
Milarepa is ordered by his mother to basically murder his family by learning black magic, which he does, and then he spends the rest of the story basically trying to change his karma and sort of atone for what he's done. But so this is a much more kind of serious, dour character. And my wife said, your dwarf was always so high spirited about everything, and that I think that's the part of you that I fell in love with. And I think this wizard you're playing is the part of you that writes books.
I forget. Did you go to Boston University?
I did, yeah, yeah.
Were you assigned Milarepa by a professor of Buddhism there?
I never read that book at
Oh,
BU, but
interesting.
I read it as an undergraduate twice. But I did TA for David Eckel,
Oh, there.
who's
That's
a very famous professor of Buddhism.
I had him at 8 a.m. in the late 1990s, and I I found that he had a great courses, and I was absolutely overjoyed to hear his voice again talking about Buddhism, and it really took me back. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just don't have many Boston University graduates to chew the fat over. When did you graduate?
I graduated in 2011, December 2011.
Okay,
Yeah.
see, I was there a good 10 years before you. So, um, all right, but moving on from that. So, why did you now? Did you fall away from D&D and come back for fifth edition?
Yeah, I've never played fourth edition in my life. When I was in college, we all played third edition. Of course, I played second edition. I've really never played first edition either. So I'm kind of, yeah, two, three, and five are the ones that I know pretty well.
Oh, interesting. And why did you choose Curse of Strahd as a text that we would chew over today?
Well, I mean, I've always thought Strahd was a really cool character. I've always thought Ravenloft was a really cool campaign. I read the little TSR paperback. It was called I Strahd in high school. And so I had this kind of fondness for this character, and my wife and I were in some little Texas town, and we went into a hobby shop and they were selling it, and I flipped through it, and I just thought, it would be really fun to just run this whole thing sometime. And so we got a group of people together, and we did it. So it's the only campaign that I've really bought off the rack and run all the way through. And then I quickly discovered, well, there's a whole community of people who are all playing this and have all kind of made little improvements on it. And so then it became like a kind of a study, right? So before each game, sort of looking at how to make each element of it better. And then I have one player who's a completionist. And so when you buy it, there's this big fold out map of Barovia. And he had this really irritating habit of just picking random locations on the map and saying, I think we should all go here, guys. We haven't been here yet. Let's just go there, right? Which is a DM is the last thing you ever want to have happen.
No, especially in that adventure. If for those who've run this adventure, like it's you they're so rich in all the different locations, and they're not leveled at all, right? You've got to be ready for certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I'm running a One Ring campaign, which is the Middle Earth Lord of the Rings role playing game. And after 16 sessions of play, we finally got to Khazad Dûn and Moria, and my characters are like, okay, we're going to go in the back doors, essentially the doors that Frodo ran out of. We're going to go in the doors of Durin. Okay, great. They have a terrifying combat encounter. They managed to get the doors open. That's one session. The next session, I'm like, okay, so they're going to go in these doors. I prep they're going in these doors stuff.
Yeah.
They decide we don't want to go in these doors. We want to go over the mountain and try and find another way in. Go over the Redhorn Gate. God, Karadharas, that was what it was. So now I'm like, oh crap, I got to read all this right now. Guys, come on.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's the worst.
yeah, yeah. So, I have one piece of Curse of Strahd trivia, which is the lead writer on it, Chris Perkins, wrote the vast majority of the book over one winter break. He went away for he left Wizards, like before their Christmas break, came back at the end of it, and it was basically done. And again, there's other writers listed on it. Other people wrote stuff, and it is based on I6 Ravenloft by Tracy and Laura Hickman, and they give them appropriate credit in the book. But still, he wrote most of it in like what 10, 15 days. And I fact checked it with him. He's like, "Yep, that is accurate." And I'm like, "How did you do that? Like that did you have ham on Christmas? What did you do for New Year's, Chris? Like, I know you're single, but still, come on." Or maybe he got the writing assignment. And he was just so excited to get to do the 5e Ravenloft that he was like, "Boom, off I go." Uh, what I think Ravenloft, I6 Ravenloft, I think is the best D&D adventure of all time. And again, I think Curse of Strahd is the best 5e Wizards product. Um, I assume that it spoke to you. What is it that spoke to you, or what did you find it so enjoyable? Like what? Why was it the one you said it was the one off the rack campaign that you played? Yeah, why is that?
Yeah, I think I mean I wrote a book about vampires. I'm very pro vampire.
Oh, what's the name of the
Right.
book about vampires?
It's called Vampires Today: The Truth About Modern Vampirism. That was my first ever
God
book,
damn it!
and that's about people who actually are drinking blood.
Is
And
that
sort
the
of
truth about modern vampirism? That it's fashionable to drink blood?
well, and like how do they get the blood? How are
How do they
they?
get the blood? This is a great Scott. This is the
Yeah.
best interview we've ever done. How do they get the blood, Joe?
Well, they've figured out very quickly in the history of the subculture, biting someone on the neck is the worst possible way to extract blood from a human being, and so they are more likely to do things like use lancets for diabetes to test your blood and sort of
Ugh.
prick their donor that way and get a little bit of blood that way. But they've put a lot of thought and effort into what is sort of the least painful, most hygienic way to consume human blood, and they would also concede this is just inherently dangerous. There's no foolproof way to go about consuming human blood.
What's the line from Great Gatsby? Something about being staggered by the infinite variety of human experience. Like, gosh. And how long did it take you to write your book on vampires?
That book, well, that's kind of a separate story, but I was living in Atlanta and I found this group called the Atlanta Vampire Alliance. And I was interested in them because they truly wanted to know, are we all just mentally ill or what's wrong with us? Why do we crave blood? And there's a whole other subdivision if you've seen the show What We Do in the Shadows, who
Sure.
say, well, we're
Yeah.
psychic vampires, so we don't drink blood, but we do drain the energy out of other people. And are these the same thing or not? That's what the show is referencing. So they did this survey of like almost 1,000 vampires. It was something like that. It was hundreds of people who identify with this subculture, and they were trying to get this data, and they were asking them questions about, do you have any of these physical symptoms, or what books have you read, what movies have you watched, and so forth. And I was really interested because this showed a type of sincerity that I think people just assumed was not there, and a kind of thoughtfulness and lucidity. So I was applying to BU, so I wrote this paper to present at the American Academy of Religion. And then I thought when I went to the BU reception and tried to kind of get them to remember my face when they got my application, I said, "Oh, and I'm giving a paper, right?" So that was kind of all I ever wanted to do with the vampires. And I told the vampires this too. I said, "I want this to be a win-win. I'm trying to get something. I want you to be better understood." Right. And afterwards, I got approached by a publisher saying, "Can you make this into a book?" And I was, 27. And they knew what I didn't know, which was that Twilight was on the horizon. Right. And so then in, my first year or so at BU, I had my 15 minutes of fame as being a vampire guy at the height of the Twilight True Blood stuff. And I was on Geraldo talking about vampires, and MTV called and asked if I would host a show where I went around the country interviewing teenage vampires. They went with Jersey Shore instead. That project did not make it. And then then we moved on. I think we got into zombies instead, and then that was sort of forgotten, and I
That's
moved on to the
fast.
next thing.
That's fine. I much prefer zombies to vampires, but that's a longer conversation. That's really, really fascinating. What, why did we move from in 1980s the fear of the why the fascination? Well, you seem to be the perfect person to ask now. Why was there such a fascination with vampires in the late 90s, early 2000s that we seem to have lost? I think it's funny, Ben, because I feel like we have this we've never really directly addressed it, but we always come back to this concept of like whatever happened to White Wolf games, especially in Vampire the Masquerade, and even a lot of the other games. Why were vampires so, Joe, why were vampires so big in the late 90s and early 2000s?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. It seems to be cyclical. It seems to be about every 10 years we go on a vampire bend. It also seems that for every sexy vampire, there'll be a backlash of really hideous vampires, right?
Ah,
Uh,
they're always I'm sorry, they're always the Nosferatu are always way more interesting than the Anne Rice style vampire to me. I don't know. I love the crinkly, like completely profane, horrible probably why I like zombies so much because I love the transgressive qualities. I don't like the cosplay gorgeous vampire, but
I would
anyway,
like to quickly throw out Tracy Hickman here, seeing as how we're in the realm of Strahd. And
yeah.
again, Tracy Hickman was the co-creator of I6 Ravenloft with his wife Laura. And I was interviewing them when Curse of Strahd came out. And we had a bit of a conversation about this. I'll try and link to it in the show notes. And they pointed out that uh, they were rather disturbed by the
Yeah.
rise of the vampire as boyfriend because they
Hmm.
argue that the vampire is a mythologized rapist, and that the fear of the vampire is the fear of rape. And if you have the sexy vampire that you want to humanize in some way is about a woman accommodating herself to her abuser, was the argument that they made, which is certainly a fascinating answer. I will say that as a teen in the prime time of the vampire craze, uh, they were both damned and dark superheroes. What's the thing you're most afraid of? Death. Vampires don't die, but the only reason that they get to live beyond their term is by committing the unspeakable. And it again, having been raised Catholic, uh, and having had a mother who was, while not a moral panicker, she was certain that there was media that would destroy me in some way, and that if I saw the wrong movie or read the wrong book, that it would fundamentally alter my soul, my chances for salvation, my mental health. Um, she threw out all my Weird Al Yankovic tapes, which is
What?
really the most I know. It's the most benign example of her control, but it did also provide for a rather thrilling 20s as I'm like, ooh, now I'm going to go read all the naughty things mom wouldn't let me read when I was growing up. And, it gave a frisson of excitement to things that maybe didn't deserve it.
Well,
But that's my answer. Sorry, Scott. Go ahead.
no. I'm like literally frothing because one of the things I find strangest, and I would love to have both of your comments on this. One of the things that I've always found really interesting about both the Curse of Strahd, the 5e1, and the original Ravenloft, and very much to what you're kind of saying, Ben, is that Tracy Hickman is always contextualizing Strahd as a unrepentant. He is not an anti-hero. He is a villain, and there is nothing you have to in Ravenloft and the Strahd, you have to take him out. That's it. Like no matter how much backstory. And I want to say it's in I want to say maybe it's written in Strahd, and maybe it's the introduction, but this concept of and Tracy Hickman, as probably many of our listeners know, is he's very religious. He's a
He's a Mormon.
Christian, right? Oh, how did that escape my head? But he's a Gary Kahn, and I think he does something around his religion and his faith, and he's very much a believer, and this is very different than me. I'm all about the grays, but he's very much this concept that Strahd should represent an irredeemable, unrepentant evil that can only be destroyed. You cannot sympathize with Strahd. He must be the end of all evils, that the only thing the group can do, no matter how weirdly, despite all the backstory that we give him, despite, you are not allowed to feel sympathetic. Very much around what you were just saying is, and I didn't know that concept around he's anyway. I've always found that fascinating that Tracy Hickman very much contextualizes Strahd as in very much a black and white world. This is something to be destroyed. Do not sympathize or empathize with Strahd.
Yeah, when I played Strahd, I agreed he's a gothic villain
Hmm.
in the sense that he does have some good qualities, right? He could have been a great person, right? Had things gone differently, but he is still a villain. But it's also key to the character that he doesn't necessarily present as a villain. He's hospitable, right? He likes to make deals and things like this. And so when we played the game, my wife was a player. And she came up with this idea for a character. She said, I want to be a warlock, and I want to be a princess who became a warlock at a slumber party, right? Playing like, Bloody Mary or something like that, right? Because she's like seventh in line for the throne and she's never going to be anybody important and so forth. And she's just sort of ignored, right? So she ends up getting sucked into Ravenloft. And then I'm thinking, it says in the module, Strahd has certain goals. One of them is to find a consort or someone to replace him. So I thought, well, here comes this woman who has royal blood and is okay making pacts with evil, right? And has very, very high charisma, right? So Strahd decides I'm gonna try to woo this young warlock. And it got to the point where the party was like, but seriously, you're gonna help us fight Strahd, right? You're not gonna like fireball all of us as soon as the
The-
fight starts with Strahd.
yeah,
And she's like, no, of course not. It's right. Well, insight check, like it's a
yeah.
zone of truth,
There,
right? Uh, so it added a kind of dramatic tension, and it ended up at the kind of the resolution of the module. They do defeat Strahd, and then she decides, I want to be the new ruler of Barovia. I don't want to go home to my family. I'd rather stay and rule here.
That is one of the amazing things about D&D is everybody, knows about the ending of Curse of Strahd and we can just reference it very casually. Well, Scott and I need to have a discussion about whether or not we want to try and get you on again to talk about this or something else. But before that, since we're winding down, what should people purchase of yours beyond the obvious dangerous games, which is lurking over my shoulder?
Well, it depends on your interest. If you're super into vampires, right, I would recommend my book, Vampires Today. It's now, more than a decade old. And then my latest book is called The Exorcist Effect, and this is looking at the relationship between religion and horror movies, right? And a kind of cycle in which movies like The Exorcist claim that they are based on true events, and then people watch the movie and think that they have demons and go to the church, and the church then has to respond and actually conducts exorcisms, and those become the basis of yet more horror movies. And actually, as we were writing this book, they announced that Russell Crowe was going to be playing this very famous exorcist, Gabriel Amorth, who became an exorcist after watching the movie The Exorcist. So the cycle is very much continuing, even as our book went to press. So if you're interested in horror movies, I would check that out too. And also, one thing I realized researching Dangerous Games is how much like Hammer horror
yeah,
was an influence on early
yep,
versions of D&D.
yeah.
Can I ask if you have read Playing at the World by John Peterson?
Yeah, it's a very long book. But it's amazing. I'm really jealous at how many, primary sources he found and the work that he did to kind of put all this together and a detail that I almost really never thought was possible.
Right.
The second edition is coming out, I assume.
Yeah, I mean he's had another book out since then. He had a cookbook.
He did have a
Yeah, yeah.
cookbook.
Yeah,
Two
know how many-
cookbooks, two coffee books, game Elusive Shift and Game Wizards.
Do you
Mr.
know how
Peterson
many?
is a very prolific.
Do you know how many copies the cookbook sold?
how many?
200,000 on BookScan.
My goodness. Well, my wife got one, so yeah,
There
I
you
believe
go.
it.
A
Yeah.
hundred, one accounted for, but that was a moment when I was like, "Well, D&D is huge." Um, I
When is
will.
our cookbook coming out, Ben? What is the Reading D&D Aloud cookbook?
I don't know what to say to that, Scott. It's 9:30. I was up at 5 a.m. writing this morning. I'm lucky I'm still up and somewhat lucid and not humiliating myself here. So,
Whatever.
I will also throw out your Penguin Book of Exorcism. Am I saying the title correctly?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I cannot say I read the whole thing because I read the beginning, then I read the ending, and again, maybe it's just the Catholic schoolboy in me, but the that last account in the book, I want to say it was an exorcism in Indiana.
Yeah. Also about to be a major motion picture.
Oh my
So
God! Well, that makes sense. It was so viscerally terrifying. I can just imagine a screenwriter reading this and being like, "This is it." So if you like a good scare, like I teach seventh and eighth grade by day, and every Halloween I'm tempted to take it in and inflict it upon the children, but I'm like I would get complaints. I'd have to get complaints about this.
well,
So
I had to get the permission to include everything in that book. So I had to look up this priest, and the phone rang, and the voice said, "This is Father Mike." And I said, "Yeah, Father Mago, did you perform an exorcism?" He goes, "Yeah, yeah." Get a lot of calls about that.
in a lot
Right.
of
But he was very was very accommodating about it. And he said, "Look, this has already been leaked on the internet. It's fine. I don't have a problem with people seeing it." But for people who do church history, this is fascinating because, as you know, a Catholic priest can't just do an exorcism. They need the permission of their bishop. So for every Catholic exorcism, there is a paper trail saying, "Here are the reasons why I think this is really necessary." But we normally never ever get to see it. So this is a leaked document. So it's of tremendous interest to church historians because we get to see something that's normally totally hidden away.
I
could you
love the fact that there's a paper trail. I love the fact that there's a paper trail to do exorcisms. Like most of us have to fill out an equipment rental checkout from the thing, but it's like I've got to fill out a B/74 form so that I can do an exorcism. That is amazing.
could you give it the briefest of thumbnail sketches of this exorcism in Indiana to entice people to go and buy this book?
Sure. So there's a really terrible documentary with Zach Bagans of Ghost Adventures, and I think it's just called Demon House. This is sometimes called the 200 Demons House Exorcism. But basically, a family moved into a dilapidated house in Gary, Indiana, and began experiencing, swarms of flies in the middle of winter, and the children acting possessed. And the other thing that's extraordinary is CPS workers and police said that they saw the children doing paranormal activity, including one of them apparently ran up a wall in a hospital. And a lot
Sure.
of people have said, an athletic kid could maybe do that. It's not necessarily supernatural, but the CPS worker definitely thought it was supernatural. And the chaplain in the hospital said, "Well, you need a Catholic. We got to get a Catholic up here." And so that's when Father Michael Magano got involved. And an exorcism was approved, and he did it on the mother, and then that was declared successful. And so now there's squabbling over who gets the movie rights and who's going to play the family. But I think we will be seeing a movie version of this pretty soon.
Way to go, Father Mike. Okay. Well, we've gone over. If you Thank you so much for your time, listeners. If you subscribe to our Patreon, you can join us on Discord, where we will chew the fat over this episode. Buy my book if you haven't, Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, and Professor Laycock. I'm gonna stop recording now.